All right, I think we'll begin about 15 minutes after start is about the right student time adjustment. So I'm glad that all of you can make it. This is Freedom in the Anthropocene, an event that's being put on by Platypus at UC Loyola. So Platypus is an organization. We have chapters, several universities at Chicago and nationally and internationally. And the purpose of our group is to try to host a conversation about the history and present state of the left, political left, in order to try to consider what the possibilities are for reconstituting emancipatory politics today. This event in particular is trying to address that question with respect to the concept of the Anthropocene and sort of how that matters in terms of environmental politics. We have four great panelists today, and this event is actually only the beginning and was the first one and was going to be a series of events on this theme. So in fact, tomorrow there's going to be an event at Goldsmiths College in London, also Freedom in the Anthropocene. Might be kind of hard for most of us to go to that, but the video and audio recordings from that will be up online at our website, media. It's media.platypus1917.org. So you can check that out. It'll probably be up 3 or 4 days after the event, as will the audio and video for tonight's event, of course. I'm just going to read a brief introduction to kind of set the theme that all the panelists have agreed to sort of center their opening remarks around. And then I'll introduce our panelists, and we'll get right to it. The Dutch atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen recently characterized the period marked by the start of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century to the present as a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. This periodization is meant to capture a change in the history of the planet, namely that for the first time in history, its course will be determined by the question of what humanity will become. While the idea of an era of planetary history driven by humanity would have been viewed as a great accomplishment by thinkers of the Enlightenment, it has come to be associated with the potential demise of all life on Earth. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution and what Crutzen terms the Great Acceleration, the spike in human activities and its interaction with Earth systems following World War II, has not, after all, led to the opening of human capacities and the flourishing of ecosystems, but rather the diminishing of both. The onus on humanity to shape the course of history seems only to lead to increasingly unsuccessful attempts to avoid planetary disaster. This panel will focus on different interpretations of why the left has failed to deal with the deepening crisis of the Anthropocene throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and how and if this problem is interrelated with the growing problems associated with ecological systems across the Earth. While Karl Marx would note that the problem of freedom shifted with the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of the working class, the crisis of bourgeois society that Marx termed capital, the idea of freedom seemed not to survive the collapse of Marxist politics in the 20th century. We have asked the panelists to consider the relationship between the history of capital and the left, and thus the issue of history and freedom, and how it may be linked to our present inability to render environmental threats and degradation visible and comprehensible, and by extension, subject to its conscious and free overcoming by society. So, joining us to discuss this topic tonight, we have Stephen Vogel, who is a Shannon Brickman Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy at Denison University. He's the author of Against Nature, The Concept of Nature in Critical Theory, and of the forthcoming Thinking Like a Mall, Environmental Philosophy After the End of Nature. He has published in Environmental Ethics, Environmental Values, Rethinking Marxism, Dissent, Praxis International, and elsewhere. Fred Magdoff is Emeritus Professor at the end of Plant and Soil Science at the University of Vermont. His interests range from soil science to agriculture and food, science, production, economics, and policy, to the environment, to the U.S. economy. His science research was on ways to improve soil fertility, especially focusing on the critical role of soil organic matter. He oriented his agricultural outreach activities to explaining the application of ecological principles to food production. His most recent books are Agriculture and Food in Crisis, Conflict, Resistance, and Renewal, and What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism. Articles published in 2013 include Global Resource Depletion, Is Population the Problem?, Class War and Labor's Declining Share, with John Bellamy Foster, and 21st Century Land Grabs, Accumulation by Agricultural Disposition. Alice Weinreb is Assistant Professor of History at Loyola University Chicago, where she teaches courses in 20th century Europe, the history and politics of food, and European environmental history. Her forthcoming book, Modern Hungers, Food, War, and Germany in the 20th Century, brings together the history of state welfare policies, famines, and mass violence, and everyday food preparation and consumption, in order to trace the histories and legacies of the two world wars and the Cold War. Her second book will examine the post-war environmental movement in West Germany and the rise of a specifically German definition of a clean and healthy environment. Professor Weinreb previously taught at Utah State University and at Northwestern University, where she was a founding member of the Chicago Area Food Studies Working Group, CAFS, based at University of Illinois, Chicago. And finally, we have Franklin Dmitryev, co-national organizer of News and Letters Committees, who has been an activist in anti-nuclear, environmental justice, and other struggles for many years. He writes frequently about environmental and other matters for News and Letters, including, since 1990, numerous articles on climate change. He is co-author of the pamphlet, The Fetish of High Tech and Karl Marx's Unknown Mathematical Manuscripts. His writings have also appeared in Climate and Capitalism and other publications. He has given papers at numerous left, green, feminist, activist, and philosophy conferences, seminars, and teach-ins, as well as to Peace, Spread, and Justice at Loyola University and the Community Dialogue on Toxic Racism and Environmental Justice at Carter G. Woodson Library in Chicago. Some of his most recent writings include McKibben's Earth, Decline, Not Liberation, BP's Gulf oil spill lays waste to workers' environment, Copenhagen Climate Summit sabotages humanity's future, Eco-Socialism and Marxist Humanism, and World Food Crisis stirs revolt. So the order that we are going to go in, we'll begin with Mr. Vogel. We will then move to Mr. Magdoff, then to Professor Weinreb, and finally to Franklin Dmitryev. So that's the order. They'll each speak for about 12 minutes, and then we'll give a brief period for them to respond to their initial remarks, and then we'll move right on to question and answer. When that time comes, there's a mic set up in the back that you can just form a line. Sorry if you have to it's kind of awkward to get to. We had a bit of cluster of things over there that we had to spread out a certain way, so I apologize for that. But there's a mic back there that, so we can hear you and everything. So, all right, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Do you want me to use that mic?
Yes.
Or? Yes. Well, I probably don't really need it. Thanks. I'm pleased to be here. It's until about a year or two ago, I didn't know too much about platypus. I still don't know too much about platypus, but it seems like a really interesting and cool organization. I was very impressed. In the kind of run-up to this event, there was a lot of email back and forth with the organizers, and at one point, one of the organizers said, "We expect you to disagree with each other," and I thought that meant this was going to be a good conversation. I'm bored of the kind where everyone kind of sits there and basically has the same thing to say. So we'll see if we can get some disagreements going. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of the Anthropocene. Talk a little bit about the idea of the Anthropocene. Is that better? Yeah. Which at some level I think is a good concept and does grasp something significant about what's been going on over the last couple of hundred years, and what is increasingly going on today. But so I'd like to claim the term, but I'm also, there are aspects of it that worry me, and in particular what worries me has to do with a kind of implication that seems to exist under the surface in that term, that there was this thing called the environment, which in the past was sort of static and remained the way it was, and there were all these small animals and plants and other natural items existing within it who never changed it. And now this, big bad one has come along and is transforming it, and that's us. And that view of a kind of static environment independent of us that shouldn't be changed, that wasn't ever changed, seems to me both wrong and in certain ways dangerous. It's wrong. It's technically wrong. It's biologically wrong. Every organism is an active organism in the world, and in being an active organism in the world transforms the world. That's true of human beings, and it's true of other organisms as well. And that means that it transforms the environment of the organism. 2.5 billion years ago, there were basically these cyanobacteria began to develop the ability to photosynthesize, and with the ability to photosynthesize, they introduced a toxic gas into the atmosphere called oxygen that until that point did not exist or was in only trace amounts, causing actually the death probably of most of the existing species on Earth at that time, which were anaerobic life. So what we had there was actually, in some ways, I guess, a more serious event in which the atmosphere was transformed by organisms in a toxic way, and produced the world that we live in today. It's also not the case, for instance, even I'm not impressed necessarily by the claim that the scale of human activity in its transformation on the Earth is unprecedented. I was looking recently and saw some data that seemed to indicate that 50% of the oxygen in the atmosphere is the result of the photosynthesis of phytoplankton in the oceans. So there are other organisms that fundamentally affect the atmosphere. Of course they do. That's what organisms are going to do, is change the world that they live in. So that's true of humans as well. The problem isn't that human beings over the last few hundred years have been transforming the world. It's that we've been doing it so badly. It's that the world that's the result of our activity is such an ugly one, an awful one, a dangerous one, and possibly a doomed one. So one response to what I've been saying, I guess, is that it's a little disingenuous to make this comparison between cyanobacteria and humans. Humans, after all, can choose what they do. Humans act with intention and presumably forethought in terms of their actions, and therefore there's a kind of higher responsibility on us, and I think that's right. But at the same time, what's striking to me about the environment that we have produced and are producing is that we haven't chosen it. Nobody has said, let's have global warming, right? Nobody has said, let's have increased pollution. These are not things that are the result of any kind of social choice or any kind of intentionality. I think the actual situation that we face, its fundamental structure, is something like the following: that for each one of us, there are decisions we have to make, whether to drive my car in the morning to get to work, or whether to fly in an airplane to come to an interesting panel that Platypus is running. And with respect to all those kind of decisions that each one of us makes as an individual, the kind of calculation is, well, look, I know that my carbon footprint contributes to catastrophes that are coming and are already happening. But on the other hand, if I don't drive my car to work, or if I don't come to the Platypus event, those things are going to happen anyway. I have actually nil effect on the overall thing. Although what's going wrong, the fact of global warming, is the result of all of us acting and thinking in this kind of a way. I think that's the fundamental, interesting structural situation that we all face. So there are actions that we engage in that, when aggregated, produce consequences that none of us want, that none of us intend, that weirdly all of us can predict, but that none of us have any way of doing anything about. That's a very interesting and strange situation that we all face as individuals. By the way, it occurs in other ways as well. it's precisely the relationship that, for instance, individual investors face with respect to the movement of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Right? They make their own choices about what to purchase, what stocks to purchase, but the stock market appears like something independent of them, separate from them, essentially over and against them. I think perhaps some of you can see where I'm going here. And partly where I'm going is to say this has something to do with market systems. There are two names for this phenomenon in the literature. One is what Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons, and that's one way of thinking about what's going on here. Right? It's individuals who have choices to make, which when aggregated produce negative consequences, but which for each one of them is nonetheless perfectly rational to engage in. There's no reason why I should not add one more cow to my herd if we live in a commons, because whether I do or not, everyone else is going to be adding cows to their herds, and it's going to get overgrazed anyway. So I might as well do it. So the first name for this is the tragedy of the commons. The other name for it is what Marx called alienation. I think these two are actually two ways of saying the same thing. The phenomenon of alienation, of what Marx in later works talks about as fetishism of commodities, what George Lukács talked about as reification, has this same structure. Marx's phrase is, it's a situation where man's own deed becomes an alien power over and against him. We are the ones who are producing climate change through every action that we engage in. But we produce it in a way that's you could say alienated. That is to say, we're only capable of engaging in private actions which have no public overall. We have that's not the right way to say it. We engage in private actions, but we have no way to speak with each other, decide together with each other what we want to do. All I can do is decide whether to drive my car or not, whether to go to the platypus panel or not. That's the only decision I get to make. We're stuck in what I want to call market relations with each other. We're unable to move to a level of politics. It's the move from the realm of the market to the realm of politics that's missing here. We're able only to engage in private or individual transactions, individual relations with each other, without any possibility of, this is the situation, for example, of the people in Hardin's story, The Tragedy of the Commons. They choose for themselves whether to add an additional cow to their herd. They have no way to talk to each other and decide together politically, how are we going to organize ourselves, what are we going to do, what's the total number of cows they're going to have, and so forth. So it's a move from seeing the world as something external to us that we produce but that we can't change and can't predict, and that feels like a fact of nature. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the economic situation in general, the fact of global warming seem like facts of nature to us. There's nothing we can do about them. We can't change them. We can't affect them. We need to find some way to do that. We need to find some way to make this not a matter of private decisions, but a matter of a public choice. Right? And that means, as I say, moving from the level of the market to the level of politics. The moral here is that when something starts to look like a piece of nature, when something looks like a fact of nature, when something looks like something that exists independent of us and natural, that's the hint that you've entered the realm of alienation. Nature itself is a kind of indication of alienation, or something that looks like nature is an indication of alienation. Which brings me back to my original point. Because what I said at first was that the idea of the Anthropocene as suddenly humans are affecting and changing an environment that used to be static and remained outside of them, that notion of the Anthropocene is a dangerous one, because precisely to see the world as something independent of us, as something outside of us, as something that we don't affect, is to be alienated, and it is in fact to kind of begin to move towards a view of the world that has, I would say, led us to the situation that we're in today. Thanks. Okay, go. Well, I'm not going to get into an argument with Steve now, but we can discuss things.
So-
yeah, if we want to, we can. There's not a lot I would like to argue about there at all. I'd like to sort of pick up a little bit with a way of looking at things. And one of them is, I know that a lot of younger people here don't know about the Pogo comic strip, but it was a comic strip done by Walt Kelly that ran for many, many years. I've forgotten when it stopped. There's a very famous one which I heard an important environmental educator, one of the well-known ones, use. And it was it's Pogo. I've got it right here. Just him. I guess he's a hedgehog. I'm not sure exactly who Pogo is. We have met the enemy, and he is us. And this fellow is an environmental educator, ended his talk with that. And it took a while until I got called on to answer this. I was in the audience. But I'd like to really say that the enemy is not us. It's not us as the human race. It's not us as individuals, and it's not the individual decisions that we make. And although we have had human degradation of the earth going back literally thousands of years, talked about in Plato, and there's a lot of evidence that humans have had detrimental effects on local and regional ecosystems for literally millennia. Something has changed, and something did change with the Industrial Revolution. And my argument is that the problem that we face, the overwhelming issue that we face, is a particular economic system, which is called capitalism, which is the system which, to most of us, seems like it's very natural, as Steve was talking about. People think it fits very well with our human nature, so-called, and that it is next to impossible for most people to imagine a different type of system. But I would contend that it is the capitalist system itself which has really brought us to this point. Not that another system might not. I'm not saying that, but capitalism works in a particular way. And what do I mean by that? First off, the whole system is based on making decisions about money, about where to invest money and how to invest money, and what to do with money on the basis of profits. Can you produce something to sell it in a market and make money off of it? And in other words, you're not producing something for people to use. You're not producing something to satisfy people's needs. If their needs are satisfied, fine. If their needs are not satisfied, like many poor people in the United States have needs that are not being satisfied for food, for good shelter, etc. So too bad, that's not the purpose of capitalism. So that you have a system where the profit motive really drives growth. When you end up with more money, what does a capitalist want to do with it? They want to invest it in something else in order to make something to sell people. And of course, nothing new in the invention. This literally goes back thousands of years also. But the ultimate wonderful thing in capitalism is to make money without making anything at all. That's just using money to make money. You don't actually have to make a product. You can just gamble. And that's what a good part of the stock market is, all these derivatives, the credit default swaps, etc. Those are essentially a giant casino, literally, just like betting on a football game or whatever. Okay, so you have this motive which is pushing growth. And also what happens in a capitalist system is that if you're making something, you're in competition with somebody else who's making the same thing or something pretty much like it. And therefore you have to outcompete them in some way. And this drives others out of business. If you're good, you've driven somebody else out of business, or you bought their business, and so you can grow larger and larger. And this also impels the system. You're always trying to increase your market share, or as they say in the food industry, trying to increase the stomach share of the American public. And what they're doing is really just positioning themselves to try to make more and more stuff to sell to people to make more and more money. That's the purpose of the system. But it's also something else that is something that we're seeing right now, and that is in a capitalist system, you need growth in order to make jobs. because, I mean, we're seeing it right now. The economy is growing at about 2% a year, corrected for inflation, or thereabouts, and that's really not enough to make a tremendous effort to decrease joblessness. We still have 2 million fewer people working than were working in November 2007 before the Great Recession began. 5.5 million fewer people in full-time jobs. Okay, this is unprecedented since 5 minutes. That's fine. I'm just flying right through this. So we're in a situation where the economy is growing, where it will double in 36 years. In other words, what all the stuff and that is being produced now will have twice as much stuff. Whether we produce it here or we import it from China doesn't make any difference in 36 years. And that is not considered to be a good enough rate of growth. The economists will say what we really need is 3 to 4% growth. That is a doubling of the economy in 20 some odd years. And that would really get us back to where we need to be. So here you have a system in which growth that many environmentalists have said or believe is really a problem, and growth is inherent in this system. Individual capitalists strive to grow. If they don't grow, they're imperiled in their position as capitalists. And we need growth in order to provide jobs. If there's no growth, there's no new jobs. And what happens when a capitalist introduces a labor-saving device and somebody is thrown out of work? That's called being more efficient. Then what happens to those people? Where do they go to get a job if there are no new jobs being created? Okay? So this is an inherent part of the system. This is not just something that happens to work this way. So there are people who have talked about, well, okay, what we really need is no growth capitalism, or we need to have degrowth. That's another aspect. That's another phrase that's used. And I would maintain that there is no such thing under capitalism. If you don't have growth, you're in a perpetual crisis. If you're growing at 1 to 2% a year, you are still in crisis. Okay, and we are in this country right now, as I think all of you are aware. And so that there is no way to design a capitalist system that doesn't grow. It is part and parcel. It is the way the system functions and the way the system has to function. And if you were to try to limit it, you would create an economic crisis. So I think that's, I did it in less than 12 minutes. I think that is the major thrust that I wanted to talk about with regard to the issue of what do you do as far as an alternative system. What you need, instead of an unmanaged commons as exists now, you need a managed commons, whether it's a fisheries or whether it's a grazing herd or whatever it is. It needs to be under conscious control by the people, instead of something just happening as what's called an externality of capitalism. Something that happens, as Steve was alluding to, as a side effect. People aren't thinking of polluting the atmosphere when they're producing electricity from coal. Okay, it's one of those side effects. And that some of those externalities can be controlled under capitalism, and we have cleaner water in the United States than we used to have, and that's because of rules and regulations that have been put into effect. Okay, so I'm not saying that nothing can be done. Some things can be done, but the basic way the system functions is anti-environmental in its very essence. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? So I'm a historian. I'm a historian of 20th century Germany. So I came at this topic from a very different perspective, and I don't usually talk directly about these issues, but indirectly through my work. So I'm going to do my best. So building off of these comments and based on my own work, which is on the history of the 20th century food economy, I suggest approaching the dilemma of human relationships to environmental crisis by problematizing a binary. And what I want to do specifically is try to historicize, I should say, these binaries, problematizing a binary that is central to the modern economy specifically, and that is a binary between the natural and the artificial, which I think is sort of taken for granted in our current system. The assumption that there is, in fact, a distinction between the natural and the man-made is at the core of our political economy and at the heart of our ecological crisis. I would argue that we need to directly address the question of how the market itself, processes of labor, production, distribution, and consumption do not exist outside of or in opposition to the natural or the environment. And in my own work on food, for example, I think that the conceptualization of what food is as a natural product that is produced by the earth prevents people from conceptualizing it as entirely related to or produced by the market. And I see this when I teach about food. I was actually just teaching about the post-war food crisis, and I taught that 60 million people died in World War II, and there was a global food crisis. And my students said, but how could there have been a food crisis? There are 60 million fewer people to eat. There should have been more food. And then you realize how food itself is so kind of separated from how people think about what we do as people, as such a natural object. How can we develop an understanding of labor and the market that emphasizes its embeddedness within the environment rather than as an opposition to it? That's sort of my question. Currently, we tend to imagine the relationship between labor and the environment in terms of being good, bad, or neutral. Thus, industrial labor, poorly paid labor, physical labor tends to be the stuff that is bad for the planet. Coal mining, industrial agriculture, truck driving, et cetera, et cetera. Good jobs or even neutral jobs are white-collar jobs. We bike to work, we recycle at our workplace, we don't drive, et cetera, et cetera. The implications of these kinds of categories is that in order to improve the environment, we all need to shift out of the negative jobs and into positive jobs. And the same approach is applied to the food economy, of course. We need to simply switch the bad foods, chemically produced, industrial slaughterhouses, etc., for local organic foods, and the problem will be solved. The market, as well, in this way, is reduced to abstract forces that act upon human bodies and upon the environment itself, but do so by following abstract rules and laws that are seen as distinct from natural things like air, water, earth, etc. In my own work, I'm trying to historicize the intimate relationship between fiscal and environmental economies. And specifically, I'm interested in the economy of war, of modern warfare, and the economy of the modern food economy. To be more specific, I'm exploring the relationship between the economy of modern warfare that emerges during the two world wars and the Cold War and the 20th century food economy. How were individual and collective food production and consumption part of the process of waging war over the past century? The ways in which war was waged, the reasons for which it was begun and ended, and war's real and imagined consequences determined what and how much was eaten around the world. This is not simply because war is very important, although it is. It is a specific, concrete reality that has a historically traceable narrative, and that's what I'm interested in trying to figure out, is why this is the case. Similarly, understandings of the political, located outside of the real or embodied, the natural, the actual environment that is currently collapsing around us, right? As living beings, our political activity is itself part of how we relate to the physical world. Our actual bodies shape our ability to be political, and I work on famine and hunger, and we all know that. In relationship to food, for example, satiety and hunger are individual physical sensations and biological realities, but they also give us or deny us political power in the current global economy. And I was also asked to briefly explore this issue in terms of a specific historical question, which is the history of political environmentalism, focusing on the rise of radical environmentalism in the 60s and 70s. And I should say I'm just really starting to think about this. It's just my first thoughts on this. The overarching question in this case that I'm asking is, what is the relationship between capitalism and environmentalism from a historical perspective? So this is something a little different. I wanted to talk briefly about the general historical trajectory of modern environmentalism, and then examine the case of Cold War West Germany, which is the main focus of my own research, or post-war Germany, I should say. Historically, we often trace the birth of modern environmentalism to the 1960s, part of the wave of experimental, left-wing, radical, often revolutionary movements of that age that we all know about. These waves of environmentalism were especially strong in Western Europe and the United States, and emerged along with more general waves of social and economic criticism that are thought of as a moment of generational clash, right? And that's how we study them historically, as a moment when the first post-war generation looks at the previous generation and decides they did things wrong, increasingly critical of their parents' political, economic, moral values, etc. As a historian of the Cold War, I wanted to bring a larger historical context to these social movements of the 60s and 70s, events which are generally interpreted outside of their actual historical context. And for me, this is especially important when it comes to the history of the left and relatedly to the history of capitalism. The world after 1945, in the wake of the Second World War, was radically different than the one before the war, And the new conceptual split between an East and a West, between capitalism and communism, had profound and wide-reaching influences on political identification and expression across the globe. And this means that the left of the 60s, you can't understand it without understanding the fact that the left is no longer the left that it was before 1945. This means that post-war environmentalism was shaped by the Cold War, or the environmentalism of the 1960s, and the new shape of the post-war political left more generally, rather than simply emerging in response to increased environmental destruction or a growing sense of threat. So I think people often think, well, it got bad enough that people finally started to get upset about the environment. But I don't think that's the right way to think about the rise of environmentalism after the Second World War, or in the 60s. This is also why earlier environmental movements, which began to gain political clout and mass appeal in the 19th century, so there was a whole wave of environmental movements in the 19th century, are largely forgotten or ignored when we think about modern environmentalism. What's interesting about these earlier movements is their explicit engagement with and often embrace of industrial capitalism. So a lot of these mass environmental movements saw environmentalism as being parallel to or working with industrial capitalism. These earlier movements remind us that environmentalism did not emerge because of the state of extreme crisis we're currently living in, but that it itself is a product of industrial capitalism and emerged alongside it. The idea that capitalism and environmentalism, at least in its current form, exist in opposition to each other, or even in response or reaction to each other, is not historically true. The vocabulary of contemporary environmentalism, conservation, preservation, recycling, cleanliness, purity, etc., are terms of high value that were created by industrial capitalism. This brings us back to the comments that I began with, which is the need to think more historically and concretely about the ways in which the natural world is imagined within our current economic and political structures. And in conclusion, I wanted to very briefly look at the post-war history of political environmentalism in West Germany, or today unified Germany, which is probably one of the most famous examples of a very strong political environmental movement, the Green Party, etc. As I just described more generally, while we're talking about the Anthropocene as a chronological marker, the history of environmentalism has a more recent framing. Usually people think of it as being a post-war phenomenon, especially, of course, in Germany. And this is one that is intricately connected to the timeline of the Cold War. And again, I'm actually interested in East and West Germany and their relationship. Divided Germany is an interesting case study for the rise of a political environmental movement for this reason, because of the incredible self-awareness within West Germany about what the left was and what had happened to the left of Germany, of course, after 1945. In this case, political environmentalism was dependent upon a strong middle class and extreme economic prosperity, so that West Germany, that gave birth to the Green Party, was an enormously wealthy and middle class society. West Germany in the 60s and 70s was a tremendously wealthy country, one that was deliberately importing workers to take over blue-collar labor in order to create a society composed entirely of the bourgeoisie, so that the green movement of West Germany came out of this particular society. The indigenous West German left that would eventually emerge out of this context were the children of this prosperity who challenged their parents' hegemonic embrace of consumption, right? As well, of course, as the racist legacies of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So there's very specific German components to this, but also very general post-war ones. The left in the Federal Republic, and specifically the German Green Party, thus had little relationship to labor and lacked any sort of existential critique of the market economy. Indeed, the remarkable success of the German Green Party is largely because they managed to develop connections to older 19th century environmental movements, and they really linked themselves to those older industrial 19th century environmental movements that linked German patriotism and ethnic belonging, often in explicitly racialized terms, to a specific imagination of a clean, pure, wholesome, natural landscape. And this discourse was at the heart of Germany's late industrialization, and actually was part of the industrialization of Germany in the 19th century. And it suggests that the West German left has to be understood in some ways as a Cold War reframing of the original 19th century process of industrialization itself. And I'm just talking about Germany, but I think those patterns we could see in a lot of other Western European environmental movements, and also perhaps in the US as well. So thank you very much.
Well, to me, the point of this discussion is not only to grasp the nature of the Anthropocene, but to transform it into something that will not inexorably plunge humanity into catastrophic climate change. I will argue for the need to work out a dialectical Marxist humanist understanding of the concept of the Anthropocene. The natural scientists who introduced the term saw the fossil fuel-powered industrial revolution as its point of origin, but they treat industry as a purely technological phenomenon. A critical understanding of industry as the world has known it reveals it to be a determinate form of a specific mode of production. So the Anthropocene is determined not by industry as such, but by capitalist industry. Karl Marx points out in Capital that the steam engine did not give rise to the Industrial Revolution, but rather the invention of machines for use in capitalist production made a revolution in the form of steam engines necessary. Production machinery driven by steam engines led to ever-growing combustion of fossil fuels. So the driving force is the capitalist mode of production, which only came into its own in the form of large-scale mechanized industry. Let's dig into this more by looking at Marx's analysis. The character of the labor process is crucial. In the capitalist factory, the machine dominates the worker, and the worker acts as an appendage to the mechanism. Marx calls it the dialectical inversion of subject and object, where the object dominates the subject, not the other way around. This dialectical inversion underlies the Anthropocene central contradiction that the character of the age is determined by human activity, and yet humans seem incapable of controlling the trajectory of our own activity. This dialectical inversion is inscribed in a hidden form in the phenomenon of value. We're not talking about value in a moral or psychological sense, but in the capitalist economic sense. Under capitalism, the driving motive of decisions about production, its speed, its technology, even its location, is maximizing production of value, or to be more precise, maximizing the procurement of surplus value. Marx shows that value is the form of appearance of objectified labor under the capitalist mode of production. Or to be precise, value is the objectification of abstract labor, pounded down to one quantitative dimension of socially necessary labor time, and abstracted from all other aspects, including material aspects. This becomes crucial when you want to see why it has these environmental effects. It's not a theoretical construct, but rather the actual basis of capitalism's functioning. Value, the objective form taken by alienated labor, takes on a life of its own as the driving force of society and stands in opposition to workers, the subjects of labor. In other words, the dialectical inversion of object and subject is the expression of value as dead labor dominating living labor. It is seen strikingly in production, where the machine is the material bearer of value, and in this way rules over the worker. Industry's output of waste, including greenhouse gases, is determined by its internal nature, its process of production, where the needs of the subject, the worker, are subsumed by the drive of value to expand itself. The trajectory of this historical period is determined not by humanity's growing productive powers as such, but rather by human power in an alienated form that stifles human development as much as it creates the potential for development by expanding productivity. Marx did not write a manifesto calling for more production, but rather called for freedom, liberation, the emancipation of workers, for the becoming of the social individual, appropriating the human powers that exist now in alienated form. His concept of progress was neither determinist, unilinear, nor productivist. He defined wealth not as material goods, but as the absolute movement of becoming. Thus, the Marxist humanist philosopher and revolutionary Raya Dnievskaya pointed out that Marx projected a conception of a new society based on expanding human forces during a century in which the whole cultivated world thought of expanding material forces as the condition, activity, and purpose of all liberation. She points out that in contrast to the Grundrisse, which is one of the things that we sort of discussed before this, Capital makes this concrete in showing machinery as a monster in the labor process and highlighting workers' resistance to the discipline of capital in the process of production. Productivism is not an attribute of Marx's theory, but rather is what he recognizes as production for production's sake in capitalism's law of motion, which involves the ever-growing accumulation of capital at one pole and misery, unemployment, and revolt at the opposite pole. The fact that the USSR followed the same law of motion does not prove that socialism is the same as capitalism, as some critics of Marx would have it, but rather that what called itself socialism was actually state capitalism. Similarly, the fact that value abstracts from nature is not a consequence of Marx's theory, but rather is the way capitalism works. In Marx's analysis of industry, he pointed out some of the consequences, concluding that capitalism only develops by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. That's his actual words. It disturbs the metabolic interaction between humanity and the earth, and compels its systematic restoration as a regulative law of social production, and in a form adequate to the full development of the human race. Just as our scientists hold a dehistoricized view of industry, so do most green critics of Marx. In their view, industry is the root of environmental evils, and they mistakenly believe that Marx was an uncritical advocate of industrial development and of what some call productivism. One favorite argument is that since socialism, in other words, Russian state capitalism, proved itself just as bad as capitalism and environmental destruction, which is true, therefore the blame must lie with what they have in common, industry, understood as a technological phenomenon. This is reinforced by that type of Marxism that accepts state capitalism as socialism and defines the difference largely in terms of property relations, that is, private property versus nationalized property, possibly with a democratic gloss. We'll do it differently than Russia and China. We'll have planning, but it'll be democratic. As opposed to actual human relations, beginning in production and involving the breakdown of the division between mental labor and manual labor, but also crucially involving relations between the sexes, between races, between nations, between sexualities. And I think this goes much deeper than framing it in terms of something like the tragedy of the commons. The question of state capitalism in Russia is not an academic question of past history, but is crucial to finding our way forward today. Much contemporary radical theory is dominated by an overwhelming consciousness of defeat and loss of confidence in human power as the power to transform society. It's grounded in the actual history of revolutions that have failed or transformed into opposite, such as Russia, China, or Iran. That transformation into opposite showed the urgent need for new beginnings in philosophy and the concreteness of Marx's point that social revolution goes beyond negating private property to the negation of that negation. That is, the transcendence of communism, or humanity reappropriating what it has made. That involves the reintegration of the human being's activity in all its moments, including relationship to nature. However, those failures of revolutions are too often theorized as the universal essence of human nature, so that liberation becomes defined less by the need for human development than by the need to limit human activity. And I think this is not only green theory, I think it's central to a lot of postmodernism. This retreat from revolution is developed in theory as the impossibility of any transformation that results in true liberation. This is in stark opposition to Marx's concept of the development of human power as an end in itself, as the very definition of the true realm of freedom. This departure from Marx is the basis of attempts like Ted Benton's to green Marx, because he wrote the book, or he edited the book, The Greening of Marxism. Whether this view is held in green theory or in eco-socialism, it is based on an uncritical identification of human power with the alienated capitalist form of human power as manifested in capitalist industry. And again, that is reinforced by the fetishism of industry and science promulgated by official Soviet theory and echoed by theoreticians like Louis Althusser. Paradoxically, the reaction against the destructive effects of human power out of control would only doom us to be unable to halt that destructive trajectory. That is so because the only way to take control of the consequences of human production is to wrest it from its subordination to the drive of value to reproduce itself in the rampage of production for production's sake. That can only be accomplished by the most daring and thorough act of social revolution and abolition of capital. We do not freely control our actions in today's society, and renouncing the expansiveness of human power in its unalienated development would block the way for achieving such control. So we need to recapture Marx's philosophy of revolution with its focus on freedom as the opposite of today's social reality. The Anthropocene contains its opposite as potential, a new period in which human activity would still be a determining factor, but with a trajectory based on the revolutionary unity of the subjective forces of liberation on the one hand, that is, people who revolt and the ideas of revolution, and on the other, the very objective working out of the fundamental contradiction of capitalism that Marx theorized. That is to say, what we have known so far of the Anthropocene is a period where crucial planetary systems have been determined by human activity in an alienated capitalist form. That includes the chemical composition of the atmosphere and the oceans, it includes the climate and the biosphere and other things. But if humanity is to avoid destroying the basis of civilization, we must grasp and bring into existence a second Anthropocene that is the negation of the first, a period where the determinant is not alienated human activity under the thrall of capitalist value, but free human activity.
Thank you. So we'll have a 10-minute or so period, a few minutes for each panelist to try to sort of respond to the initial remarks. You can sort of do that on your own, but to perhaps give a little bit of a direction. One thing that struck me in all of the initial remarks was that I think all of you in sort of very different ways sort of address this question of how society and the development of society and history is both a sort of human product and also something that seems beyond the kind of ability of humanity to kind of easily change. It's kind of it's being influenced by so many different factors and processes. And that things like industry and the market are both part of our lives. They condition our lives, obviously, and they're also a product of human activity, but seem to not be susceptible, or at least not presently, certainly, to sort of conscious political change. And I think all of you kind of had that as a kind of touchstone, but then went in very sort of different places with it, and I thought that was interesting. So I guess my question, or one question that you might want to take up is, all of those things, industry and the markets and the question of jobs, do have a certain political valence already that's kind of acknowledged, I think, in the mainstream, at least in a certain way. The question of jobs is a political concern, not just for us, but I think, publicly, very much so. But the kind of way in which that's talked and thought about and sort of politicized, including, both in the mainstream and also perhaps not in the mainstream, but amongst the left, seems to be inadequate. There seem to be different, you talked about environmentalism after the post-World War II, question of like attempts to manage the commons, and also, Franklin, you talked about sort of a kind of the weight of failed revolutions impacting us in the present. So I guess my question would be, given all of those different factors, and how exactly are those playing out in the present, and what type of kind of, politics or political framework might we begin to imagine that would sort of bring some air into that, or would perhaps point up a new direction? That's kind of a tall order, but that seem to be maybe to, as we said earlier, to kind of bring out some of the differences more so in the discussions. But we'll go in the same order, beginning with Steve.
Well, I think I just have a few comments. I mean, and most of my reaction was, oh, I guess we didn't disagree after all, which is okay because we're all right, so that's really fine. I mean, it was striking to hear very similar themes among all four of us, as you say, from really different points of view. Let me say something maybe about two of them, which go in really different directions, I suppose. One is, I mean, I really appreciate your bringing up the issue of the failed revolutions of the 20th century, which, and maybe this is separate from the other issues here, but I must say, I think that's a really important thing for people on the left to constantly be thinking about. It's and not to quickly dismiss as, well, it wasn't really socialism, or we didn't really do it right, or but now it's going to be okay, or let's just try again, or everything takes hundreds of years. The catastrophe of what happened to the left in the 20th century, the horror of what happened in the 20th century, I think is something that we ought never to forget, and to be really thinking really seriously about what will be different and what mistakes were made in Marxist theory, from the beginning that led to that. So I just want to leave it with that remark. I think that's important to keep track of. On a different topic, I mean, I really appreciate and with you in the desire to question and deconstruct, so to speak, the binary of the artificial and the natural. I think perhaps it wasn't clear, but that's what I was really trying to say.
No,
but maybe I want to go one step further, or at least push you to go one step further, because at least at one point I sort of heard you kind of saying we have to, we should not think of the social level of labor, for instance, as distinct, as not embedded in the environment. That one of the problems we have is that we think of those things as separate, and that's right. We have to understand labor is embedded in the environment, but what I was also trying to suggest is that we have to understand the environment, so to speak, is embedded in labor, which is to say that the environment itself is something which is produced through labor, or produced, I was saying, through the transformative activities of organisms of all sorts. There isn't this thing called the environment out there that we have to recognize our connection to. It's a connection that goes in two directions, I guess is what I wanted to say. And in some level, I've been in various things I've written and thought about. My first book was called Against Nature. It's like I really think the concept of nature itself is a dangerous one, and is one that we ought to try to get rid of and stop using. That it always represents this world which is independent of human beings, which is over and above human beings, which is supposed to be an external factor that limits and constrains them. And there is no such thing, for better or worse. Sometimes it would be good if there were, but there is no such thing. Anytime something looks like something which is independent of us and over and against us, I think the project ought to be always to try to deconstruct that and to try to show the ways in which actually it is the result of human activity. And therefore is something that we ought to try to, as several of us here said, try to take a kind of control over. That the problem has been that we don't control it. It's not that we try to control it too much, it's that we don't control it enough, I guess. So I'll leave it at that.
And let me pick up on a couple of issues, not necessarily what Nate asked, but we can get back to that if we want to. one thing is my understanding, and I was involved in it somewhat, but this is nothing I've studied, but the environmental movement in the United States that started in the 60s, getting going really in the 60s, the left, the traditional left, was really not involved in it. The traditional left had very little interest in it, and I think the left in the United States has come to the environmental movement relatively late, or just maybe not the environmental movement, come to recognize the environmental crises that we're facing, and it's not just one crisis of global climate change. There are many others as well, including pollution of all of us and other living things too, and all sorts of chemicals that have been introduced into the environment. And one of the issues that has played out over time, and it's still there now, is the whole issue of the environment versus labor. That is, protection of the environment versus labor in the environmental movement. And this is something that's very important, and somehow it's understandable how it happened. If you're going to stop the spotted owl from disappearing, you have to stop cutting down some trees in the Northwest. And if you're going to do that, then some loggers are going to lose their jobs. This is stuff that happened in the 70s or 80s, and that it shows the irrational part of our system, in that people have to take the type of jobs that are available, whether they're healthy for themselves or for the environment or not, has nothing to do with it. And there was a coal miner who, after he retired, said he really feels terrible about blasting the tops of these mountains in West Virginia to expose the coal seams, but he said we needed jobs. And when you have a system that doesn't provide other types of jobs, and this is it, you can understand that whole issue and the confrontation, in a way, that happens frequently between the environmentalists and labor. And I would say it's now that much of the left, or what you might call the traditional left, or socialist, or Marxist, have come to understand how severe the environmental crisis is, that they are trying in their way to try to resolve this. Something else I'd like to mention is that talking about productivism, so much of what is produced in this society is absolutely socially useless. Not only useless, a lot of it is actually negative on human beings or the environment. A very high percentage, there's $1 trillion a year that goes in one way or another into warfare in the United States. And much of that to produce stuff which is of no use to anybody for anything except to kill people, obviously. But there's also probably about half of everything that's produced and half of the labor that's used in the United States. I mean, this is obviously rough numbers. I haven't gone down to try to calculate it. Is not needed. It's not needed to produce what human beings need to be able to fulfill their human potential. A lot of it is to produce junk and convince you to buy stuff that you don't need. There was a story. It's a little bit humorous, but it's really an indication. You know, everyone is supposed to be entrepreneurial. You're supposed to go out, since it's a tough job market, you should go out and find some way where you can make money on your own. And there were these two women who thought of the idea. Apparently, I wasn't aware of this before I read it, that there are people who have operations, mainly women, they have booty lifts. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. Apparently, some men are doing it. Maybe, I don't know. But everybody knows what that is. Apparently, yeah, everyone. Anyway, they devised a mechanical booty, just something that you could make, that you could put on and wear to look as if you had a booty lift. They sent the plans to Asia. They produced them. They got on some television program, smart telemarketing, and they sold like 2 million of them like this. Well, any system that allows that waste of human and material resources for such stupidity, I know it's not a big deal in the greater scheme of things, but it's an example of what happens. So you've got to take control in a way that Steve was talking. We have an unmanaged system. We have a system that's only managed at the firm level, that is at the corporation level, or if it's managed to a certain extent at the national level or international level, it's managed in order that the firms should be able to do whatever they want to do. That the corporation should be able to make whatever they want to make, wherever they want to make it, with whatever labor they have available, and to repatriate profits, and et cetera, et cetera. So that is the type of management that is this. It's not the management in the sense of managing your resources from a humane or environmental point of view at all. One other thing I'll mention, and then I'll quit. That we also need to learn from the positive things of the failed revolutions. And I would say that there is much in the Chinese Revolution to be learned, and there are things to be learned, also in the Soviet Union. But what happened in China was truly remarkable, and the takeoff of China after the transition that started with Deng Xiaoping, the economic transition in the late 70s and early 80s after the Cultural Revolution, was only made possible because of what had happened before, the development of an agriculture which really could feed its people, the development of the irrigation systems that were needed for that, some of the basic infrastructure that was necessary for a more advanced society. These were put in place beforehand, and it was then taken advantage of during this transition to capitalism in China, which has taken place. But there are many things with regard to agriculture and with regard to the whole issue of how do you keep leadership under control of the people. And essentially it was impossible, but which may be something that we need to think through. But this is one of the themes that played out from the beginning, from Fan Shen. If any people have read Bill Hinton's book about a village in China, which was written about events that took place before the communists entered Beijing, until the Cultural Revolution, there was a recurring theme of how do you get the people in control of the Communist Party, and how do you get them in control of the economy. And this, to me, was one of the things. Obviously, they didn't do it, but it's one of the things that we need to learn about these issues and the ways that they were attempted to deal with, and to try to understand how they failed. Anyhow. Yeah, oh, excuse me. Got to pass this down.
I don't have that much to say. I think I'll just briefly speak to what you said. You've wrote a whole book on it, and I think you actually have a lot more to say, know a lot more about this concept of nature than I do. I think we sort of agree. I mean, my idea, what I was saying, is that this binary of natural and man-made is a problem, right? And I guess the only thing that I would add to what you said, which I completely agree with, is to sort of maybe have us ask more specifically and concretely what sort of function the category of nature actually serves. I mean, what do we gain, or who gains what from the application of this word nature? And I guess to me, what I guess I was interested in, and what I think about a lot, is the way in which naturalizing something takes it out of the political sphere, which I'm sure and so and potentially takes it outside of the economic sphere as well. And maybe in that sense, just to very quickly address what you briefly mentioned about sort of the actual history of environmentalism in the 60s, or in the U.S., I should say, and its lack of direct connection with the traditional left or the labor movement, which of course is kind of also what I was talking about this sort of post-1945 moment. And again, just to reiterate that I do think it's important that there were earlier environmental movements in the 19th century that actually were very focused on labor, and a lot of the early movements for conservation were supposed to be to save the forest for industrial workers to be able to recoup their sad times in the factories, And I mean, I think, and a lot of the stuff that's done in the U.S., a lot of the parks, a lot of the parks that were founded were actually done out of this agenda, which was, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say it's bottoms up, but there were a lot of, obviously a lot of labor activism in some sense involved in those kind of movements of conservation. And I think that is, I love the parks, but I think it is also suggestive that we have to sort of, the relationship between labor and the environment is not easily resolved by having it be labor and the left, and therefore successful environmentalism, versus, the right and corporations and negative environmentalists or something. I think it's actually just historically more complicated, and that's kind of what I wanted to say as well.
Okay. I think that, as Nate pointed out, that we all do see that what human society is doing is something that is out of our control. But there's a very big question about, is it possible for humanity to achieve control over that before it's too late? And if so, how? And so I want to stress, first of all, it's not too late. But we need to be very focused on actually working on a social transformation that's deep enough to change the direction of society. And so the question of what does it take to change that direction is really incredibly important, and one that is sort of left out of all of the mainstream dialogues about climate change, not even necessarily consciously, but because there's an assumption that, because there are a number of scientists and engineers and so on who've written books that have these beautiful plans about how if we just did this, this, and this, we could really bring greenhouse gas emissions down to zero. And I don't question the technological feasibility of these things, but the problem is the political reality is that they never happen. And the people who put these plans out recognize that, but they're very reluctant to even let themselves ask the question, why is that? Other than, there are these right-wing foundations that have all this money from the Koch brothers and ExxonMobil and so on that are bankrolling these propaganda campaigns. And this is true. It's not that it isn't true. It's true, and it has a major effect on public opinion. And it's a bunch of lies. But there's something much deeper than that. Obama is a president who, I believe, understands that climate change is a serious threat. And if he had his druthers, if there weren't any political problems in the way, boy, he would sure love to do something about it. But guess what he's doing about it? Almost nothing. He's doing something. I'm not saying he's doing nothing. But it's in comparison to the scale of the problem, it's almost insignificant. And none of these people want to address the economic roots of the politics that prevents anything real from happening. And we ourselves don't necessarily have the same views of what that takes. And I would go back to the Second International after Marx died, and the sort of dominant view of the socialists of that period was that capitalism is unplanned, it's the anarchy of the market, the chaos of the market, and it causes all these terrible things. And what we need is planning, a planned society. And I think what happened in when World War I broke out and socialists found themselves on different sides of the war, and there was sort of a collapse of the Second International, was one of the things that some of the revolutionaries found was that wasn't sufficient. Am I going on too long? But in our day, I think there's sometimes a return to that view, only everybody realizes there was something wrong with what happened in Russia, so we're going to do it differently this time. And we're going to have planning, but it'll be democratic. And if it's democratic, then, we can avoid having this tremendous environmental destruction like the planning in the Soviet Union allowed to happen. I think that it has to be much deeper than that. You have to see that even though they had nationalized industry, they had central planning, they had all these experts who were doing the planning, that they were still beholden to the law of value. And if you're beholden to the law of value, then you're not going to be able to break that growth imperative that Professor Magdoff was talking about, that is an essential, I agree with you, it's an essential part of this system. So we've got to break what underlies that growth imperative. Otherwise, capitalists can continue trying to grow, and it takes no account of what is needed for sustainable civilization.
Nate, can I just put a comment in here on that?
We should get.
If not, it's okay. If you don't,
Take it quick.
okay. Let me just do it quick.
Very quick.
Just picking up on Franklin, and I will do this quick. I think planning is not the issue. I think the issue is that what's needed is an economy, instead of an economy that's based on production for the sake of profits. You need an economy based on satisfying human needs, that the purpose of production is to satisfy basic human needs, which includes cultural, recreational, physical, and it includes the environment. We need, as many other organisms do, a clean environment. And so I think that is the difference. And if that is the vision of production for human needs, there's no way in the world that you can do that without some sort of planning. Now, maybe planning from the bottom up, not planning by bureaucrats, as what happened in the Soviet Union, but by people very much involved in their communities. But so I think planning is a major issue and an important issue, and one that is going to have to be part of a post-capitalist society if we're going to have a system that's based on production for satisfying human needs. Sorry for that.
That's okay. So you can leave it over there. Please feel free. There's a microphone in the back. So please, feel free to line up, ask any questions, and our panelists can just sort of take up those. You could direct them to individual panelists or just to sort of whomever.
So I'm not sure if this was covered already, but I guess my basic question is, why did the old left not attend to issues of the environment more carefully? Personally, I'm sympathetic to the idea of booty lifts for all who want them.
Or the plastic surgeons.
I would join it. But I think what that gets at is this issue of a politics of abundance versus a politics of scarcity. And I guess my question is also, has the left looked at capitalism since the Second World War and basically decided that politics of global abundance is impossible? And how does that relate to environmental politics on the left? Does the left still seek a kind of global society in which every individual has a very high standard of living and participates in society in a cosmopolitan way? That seems to be, to me, something like the vision of the old left. And I'm wondering if that's a vision that you all would sort of subscribe to or rather consider yourselves against.
It's been estimated that if everyone in the world was to live at what's considered to be a middle-class Western standard of living, we'd need 4.5 Earths. And the problem is there's only one. So it's clear that if we're going to have 9 billion people in 2050, they are not all going to be able to live at that standard of living. And if we're going to have an ecologically sound and socially sound system, we're going to have to live more modestly. It's been estimated by the World Bank that the wealthiest 10% of the people in the world consume 60% of the world's resources. Okay, I mean that's just unbelievable. The problem with population or with people isn't that there's too many people in the world. And it's certainly not too many poor people with regard to the environment. The problem is too many rich people. And that's a lot of people, by the way. 10% of 7 billion is 700 million. We're talking about a lot of people. So to answer that question, I think traditionally maybe that was the thought. But of course, the standard of living back then was much less, much lower. The middle class standard of living back in the 1930s or 40s, was quite a bit lower than it is now. But it's impossible. It can't be done. We're all going to have to live at a modest standard of living. We're going to have to define. Evo Morales in Bolivia talked about living, that we have to stop thinking about living better, because that implies something that's going to keep increasing. That what we have to try to aim for is living well. And then we have to define that, what that means for people. And we have to try to meet that for everybody.
I'm afraid I'm going to end up coming out in favor of booty lifts too, or the possibility. Well, get in trouble. I want to say a word for democracy, I guess. I think, I don't know. It seems like you and I are disagreeing, but I'm not quite sure where. Because mostly I really like all the things you're saying. But I do get nervous about talk about living more modestly, that we have to live more modestly, that we have to live, not try to live better, not have booty lifts if we want them, live in accordance with what people really need, because I keep wondering who decides this. And for that reason, I think it's really important that the fundamental value be a democratic one, that we decide this, and together in some kind of conversation about how we want to live, and that we don't, prior to that conversation, say anything really about what the results of that conversation are going to be. That was maybe too strong what I just said, but that's kind of how I'm feeling at this moment. That it's not that there's some external, it's nature again. It's not that there's some external standard about how human beings are supposed to be living, that we should be trying to figure out what it is. It's that we are the human beings who are deciding ourselves alone about how we want to live. Maybe we want booty lifts, maybe we don't. I don't know. But it's not that there's something external to us that determines what we really need and what we don't really need. That makes me nervous.
Let me argue.
Okay.
One of the points was to have an argument here.
Okay.
We can't all have booty lifts, okay? We can't all have whatever we want. I agree absolutely with what Steve said up until that point. This needs to be democratically decided, probably starting with the community level, as to what we need for a decent life, to live well. And like I said, I'm not just talking about physical things. I'm talking about other aspects, music, culture, the recreation, whatever. But it is going to be much more modest than what's called the Western middle-class standard of living. We just can't have it. It just won't work, okay? There's just not enough of this stuff. And if we're going to get the stuff, we're going to pollute the hell more out of the world. But anyway, it's not there. Like I said, you need 4.5 worlds. So it's not possible for us to sit around and talk about the sky's the limit. We have to say we are going to live modestly, but what do we need? What do we need for a good life in our community? What does that mean? What does it mean for the schools? What does it mean for after-school activities for the kids? What does it mean for jobs? What do we really need? And I think that does have to be decided on democratically. I think planning has to be decided on democratically too. But we can't just say whatever humans decide is fine, because it's not true. It will not work.
I could respond, but we should probably continue.
Other
Yeah.
panelists want to address that.
Okay, I think there were two questions, but I want to address the one that people are talking about first, which is, to begin with, I think Professor Magdoff made two important points. One about the 4.5 Earths that if everybody in the world can't have global abundance if it's defined in the present terms of existing society. And he also earlier had made a point about just how much of what is produced is useless or negative. And I think that's actually only the beginning of seeing all the superfluous activity that could be eliminated. Look at how much people are commuting, driving to work and back home. Is that crazy or what? This is, if you look as if you were an alien from another planet and how irrational a lot of the systems of our society are, you'd find tremendous number of things. The CTA just spent millions of dollars or whatever to put in this VentureCard system when anyone in their right mind who's not thinking like a capitalist would have said, why don't we just make writing on the CTA free, and then you don't have to have all this machinery that you pay for to take whose whole purpose is to take people's money and to keep track of the money, and you wouldn't have as many people driving on the roads if it were free to go on the CTA. I know people who have trouble affording the amount of money that it costs to ride a CTA. But my point is that we need a whole new way of life. Environmentalists have been saying it, socialists have been saying it. They got to learn something from each other because they both have a point. And we should aim for global abundance, but not as it's defined now. Global abundance, Marx, the big point that he was making when I quoted about the absolute movement of becoming is wealth is, you can't just measure it in terms of, not only in terms of dollars, but in terms of material goods. That's not really what wealth is about. It's necessary to an extent, If you don't have enough food to eat, then that's not good. But we have to think about a society where we can make those kinds of decisions. And I hope I didn't come off sounding like I was against planning, but it's just that planning in itself isn't enough. You have to have a basis for life where you can plan it, and the law of value is not going to upset your plans, which happened in the Soviet Union. And the other question I think you asked was an important one about why did the old left not address issues of environment. I'm not going to take the time to give a complete answer to that. But I do think that one of the real problems of the 20th century was viewing what happened in the USSR as socialism. And it sort of gave license to ignore environmental problems. Because if you admitted them, if you really believed that was socialism, and you admitted how bad the environmental destruction in Russia was, and that it was important, you might have to do some serious rethinking.
I just wanted to also very quickly address that question, which I also think is just maybe more historically specific, or specifically I think with the U.S., one of the issues with the left and environmentalism after World War II, I would have thought also is just that environmentalism is obviously like a very middle class or upper middle class movement, and I think the environment and the natural have been associated with sort of material wealth, and it's become commodified, and so and I think and we still think that it's expensive. I mean, the idea is that nature has this value, right, that it has its own intrinsic value, and therefore it's expensive, and it costs money, and we have to be able to pay money to protect this environment. And I think that would allow, of course, the left to say we have to wait until the workers get more money and more affluence before they then can start protecting the environment. So I do think there's, and that's just a historical, I think it used to be different, but I think that is kind of a contemporary, more post-war phenomenon in that way.
I just wanted to return to something that we just discussed, decide what humans need in a democratic fashion. Just on the case that a lot of environmental issues are very global and international, and in deciding humans would need democratically would involve many, many people, many different viewpoints, many different nations, and et cetera. There's no, obviously, a correct answer. I just wanted to know what your thoughts would be on how these democratic decisions would be made and who would be involved, and et cetera.
I just say quickly, so I guess honestly, if I were to think about it, I don't think that beginning with the question of what humans, I don't think that the question, how can we fulfill human needs, is the place that one can begin if one wants to create. I mean, I think that question is already predicated on the idea that being the goal. And if the goal is then the fulfillment of human, even if it's human desires or human basic needs, I think that is not actually how the world works in some ways. I think
I don't know if this answers the question really, but what has been happening in Venezuela at the community level is really quite interesting. And there's lots of problems in Venezuela. By the way, the United States is doing everything it can to destabilize the economy of Venezuela at this point. And they have their own problems causing instability, but that's a different issue. But the development of the community councils in the country and the power that was given to the community councils and the resources that were given to the community councils, to me is a very interesting aspect of that revolution, or the attempt to really create a socialist society, starting and doing it within a capitalist society, and which I'm not sure is possible. But anyhow, what happened with the community councils was that there are some 30,000 of them. I think there are some communities that were fairly wealthy, and they decided they didn't want to have a community council, and the government said, that's fine. You don't want one, you don't have to have one. But almost all of them formed of some hundreds, so 300-400 families, and they were charged with deciding what they need in their community with regard to infrastructure. Okay, this is just one thing, or this isn't all basic human needs. But what are your priorities for infrastructure in your community? Is it a new school? Is it a clinic? Is it roads? I visited one community where the women just got fed up hauling water because there was a water main maybe a half mile away, and they wanted to just bring the water to their village. And so they prioritized what they felt were their needs, and funds were given. This is oil money, of course. That Venezuela, that is the resource that they have, and these communities actually created a lot of this with volunteer labor, and with expertise and with material from outside, and were able to build what they felt they needed. Was it electricity, or was it something else? So I think there are ways to do it at the community level. Now, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what this community decides may be different from what that community decides. Then how do you resolve it? I don't have the answer to it. I mean, it's going to have to be resolved in the struggle, really. And then this other country over there decides something else. I'm not talking about just two communities that are 20 miles away or something. What about one that's 1,000 miles away? I don't know how we're going to get there. But I think that obviously there needs to be things happening at a higher level than the community level. What I mean by that is just geographic level, regional or multi-regional level. But and the communities have to be allowed and given the wherewithal, the space to be able to make these decisions, and the resources to enable them to carry out the decisions. But I think that's an idea of how it might happen, and how it all gets resolved between different visions of it, I don't know. But we've got to start thinking and talking about visions, and about the future. And anyway, that's one example of doing it in a very modest way, one piece of that story.
I mean, I was afraid of that question actually, because I just don't know the answer to it, and that's a really serious problem. I agree with what you're saying. That is to say, it seems to me there are examples at the local level of this sort of thing, and I think we ought to be trying to build them and develop them. When you start talking about global issues, it really is hard to understand how it's going to work. The one thing I'd say is, you know, and to this extent, again, I think we are still agreeing. It involves people changing their view about how you think about these problems, so that these questions are not to be thought about in terms of what's best for me, also not to be thought about in terms of what's best for the world or for us, but to be thought about in terms of what could we agree to? What would people be able to, that's not quite the same question. What would people be able to agree to? And that's what I ought to do. Something that I would be able to justify to my neighbors, to other people in my community, and to other people on the other side of the world. You know, behavior that I'd be able to justify to them. I think, you know, in so many ways, we're not taught to think that way. You know, we're taught a kind of individualism whereby each person decides for himself or herself what to do, and the hell with everyone else. You know, one form of that is the idea that what it takes to be environmentally progressive is, you know, to drive a Prius and to ride your bike and to recycle. I'm being virtuous. Who cares about anyone else? I'm being virtuous. I think we have to think about these things in terms of public communal activities and agreements.
Just to add one quick thing to that, I talked about revolution, and revolution is not just a change of political structure. It's not even just a change of the social structure. It's individuals changing themselves in the process, and that has to be part of that concept, I think. That I look forward to the day when the average person would say, why would people want to get a booty lift? You know, the cosmetic plastic surgery. Why would someone want to buy an assault rifle? Why would someone want to eat McDonald's hamburgers every day? You know, something like that. So that, just to say, that has to be part of that process.
I guess I have a question, sort of following up the discussion, like the disagreement between Vogel and the fact that you would disagree about sort of, I guess I put it in terms of politics of scarcity or surplus. The fact that you could have this disagreement about booty lifts and yet have this like agreement about democracy says something to me about the inadequacy of the category of democracy in terms of grappling with the problem of how to decide what is to be done. And I guess really the question for Vogel, you talked about the importance of learning the lessons from the failed 20th century revolutions. And I guess could you talk a little bit more about what those lessons are?
Well, I mean, you know, one of them is to be aware of people who know what other people need, and tell them what it is, you know, and require them to act in certain ways because it's good for them. Frankly, I guess I'm not sure I got the first part of your question, because it seems to me the fact that, first of all, I have no opinion on booty lifts. I really don't. You know, maybe they're terrible. It's obvious to you too that they are. I guess right. I'm sure they are, right? But I don't want to be that guy who's saying, you know, you're not allowed to have them, basically, or this is not what human beings are really supposed to be doing, because I'm just a human being. You know, these are simply, for all of us, these are simply our contributions to a discourse. It's not that we have some kind of special knowledge here. It's just our contribution to a discourse, and what goes on in democracy is that people disagree. So the fact that we might disagree about that would be, of course, that's what's going to happen in the democratic conversation, all right? And we'll try to persuade each other. And I doubt, I suspect with a lot of things that the political decision is going to be, let people do what they want to do. All right, it's not going to be everyone has to have X or no one's allowed to have Y, but rather let people do what they want to do. There are going to be some things where it's different, but there should surely be a lot of room for people to make their own decisions.
I would hope that would be the case, but I still think that it's decisions made in a certain context that there are limits. There really are limits, and that I think they're in a post-capitalist world that is trying to live in an environmentally and socially sound way. I think there has to be substantive equality, which doesn't mean that everybody has exactly what everybody else has. But it means that there can't be somebody living over here who's got plastic surgery and let's get away from booty lifts or whatever, and has a fancy cars and does all these things, and everyone else is living at a very modest standard of living. I think that's just not possible. And I think that I think that will be the will of the people. But I assume it will be. I assume that they will be very much in favor of not allowing that type of thing to happen. But what I'm trying to say is wasn't specifically on any particular item, but it really is that we have to live. If 9 billion people are going to live in a humane way, I'm not even talking about being able to live up to their full human potential, which I would hope they would be able to. We have to live within certain limits, and those limits we are going to have to set, and we're going to have to set them democratically, because otherwise, it just has to be done that way. I can't see any other way of doing it. And I think one of the issues from the failed revolutions is once you have a vanguard party, once you have a party which sees itself as being in the vanguard and therefore better because they know more and they are more politically astute than the mass of the people, that automatically sets up a situation with other things happening as well. What happened with managers of plants in the Soviet Union really behaving as if they were capitalists in some ways, in other ways not. But you put all that together and you have a very bastardized system which in no way resembles what most people consider socialism. So I think that is one of the critical issues, that you can't have a party which has a leadership which sets itself up as controlling. That can't be. Maybe there needs to be some sort of leadership, but there has to be a mechanism set up at the beginning for control of that leadership by the mass of the people, for easy recall of anybody at any position, whether it's at a community level or at a regional level or whatever, so that can happen very easily if that person gets out of hand and does things that the general population doesn't like.
I just wanted to say very quickly that one of the things that I think is, even when thinking about failed revolutions, I studied post-war Eastern Europe, so this is what they all talk about. And I think one of the things that I think is a problem when we're thinking about human needs or basic needs is that one of the big conditions of industrial capitalism is that you think in terms of production and consumption as being separate categories, and we're all imagining human quality of life almost exclusively in terms of consumption and consumer culture and products to be acquired. And I think that is certainly one of the things that happened in post-war socialism, is that was still accepted by the governments. I mean, that there was still an idea that there was a separation between production and consumption, and consumption is how you evaluate your quality of life. And I think that is where I feel like trying to figure out the basic needs of the human population is itself within the system that's falling apart. If you're thinking of it in terms of how many products can we allow people to have, or who's allowed to buy what or whatever.
But my conception of human needs is not just material.
But then how is it material and is there a category that is the material that's separate from other categories?
Well, there's food. That's a material thing. And then there's recreation, which is not material. It's being able to play some game if you want to play, or music maybe that you make out of some junk or whatever, or a play, which doesn't need material things. It needs people doing it. Let's say. So I think, and the environment itself is material, but it's not material in the sense of we're producing it. I mean, a clean environment where the water's clean, the air's clean, the soil is not polluted. 40 million hectares in China, it's estimated, have been polluted because of using polluted irrigation water. This is a human issue. It's not a pollution issue. It's an issue of our humanity.
Yeah, just wanted to say something about the question of nature, human, and binary, etc. One of the fascinating phrases that Marx uses is the resurrection of nature. And what he's referring to there, it's not just a poetic phrase, it's actually harkens back to the heart of his whole philosophical project, which you see him laying out in 1844 in a Critique of Hegel. And that is that nature, the concept of nature and human nature has undergone a death under capitalism. It's been reduced to human beings have been reduced to objects. Nature has been reduced to its sales value or whatever. It's been destroyed essentially. And the resurrection of it is to go beyond that. That's Marx's entire project. To go beyond those binaries was to humanism and naturalism, one and the same thing. And that's the resurrection of nature would follow upon a real humanism, a real human beings being able to organize themselves freely. Freely associated labor flows from the entire history of humanity. It isn't just something that's brought in as, wouldn't this be a nice thing? Wouldn't this be a nice adjunct to our democratic program? This is the nature of humanity, this fight to be free. And that's what Marx was making the basis of humanity's relationship to nature as well, and how it's twisted under capitalism. But also, where it can go to a new realm of freedom. This is like the Golgotha, which is at the end of Hegel's phenomenology, which Marx appropriates directly in 1844. And then the resurrection. It's a new realm of freedom that follows that. From the chalice of this realm of spirits comes forth its own infinitude, the spirit, the human spirit. What that also entails, though, is that there's no shortcut to this new realm. And Marx, he goes immediately to the critique of religion. Not necessarily the critique of booty lifts, which is a kind of trivial thing, but which is nobody needs them, obviously, etc. But the critique of religion is a very profound thing that denies freedom to people. And so, how do you relate this idea of freedom? And this then becomes the critique of bourgeois politics. It becomes the critique of everyday life. And there is no shortcut to get through that. There's no way that you can say, I've hit on a formula. It's only everyone together can accomplish this. Freely associated labor really means forming a plan. It really means that. It means everyone forming the plan of how we live. And this is really a new thing. I think it was completely lost in the history of Marxism. There were, revolutionaries always, and I might disagree a little bit with some people on the panel. There were always people, Kropotkin, I always remember Kenneth Rexroth wrote about environmentalism a lot, Mikhail Prishkin in the Soviet Union. There were a lot of people who did, but they were, kind of pushed to the fringes, maybe consider themselves anarchists. But it's all there in Marx. And it's right there in chapter 1 of Capital, on the relationship between humans and nature. And where this was taken was a fall into primitive socialist accumulation in the Soviet Union. It was openly debated. It's obviously completely wrong term if you are looking at what Marx was actually saying about humans and nature and freedom and capital. How can you even create a phrase like primitive socialist accumulation, when you look at primitive accumulation based on slavery and genocide, you can't go back to it. You can't go back to it. That forced accumulation. It can only be like free association that means free association that means freedom as the nature of a human being. And I think that's ultimately what is going to be the most profound way to work out a new basis between humanity and nature. And it is philosophized. I mean, there is a basis for it. Rational. I mean, that's what's so, to me, that's what Marx's importance is a rational grasp of human history and what it means. That's the thing.
It made me think of something. If someone wants to respond to that.
Well, the only thing I would say is the term resurrection of nature makes me nervous too, because it still sounds like there's some nature that preexisted us, that got killed or something, crucified, and now we have to resurrect. And I prefer the formulation of, fully completed naturalism equals humanism, fully completed humanism equals naturalism, which has more symmetry in it. Let's put it that way. But, we can start quoting Marx back and forth to each other, and it's not that useful.
There's a quote from Marx that I'm sure somebody here knows that I don't. But I'll start off by sort of giving my version of it, which is not the quote, but it's the essence of it. And if someone can roll off the quote directly, please do. But essentially, at some point, Marx says that changed conditions or changed society will bring about a new human being, or mensch, which is translated as man, which is not the right translation. But it is the humans from the old society that are doing the creation of the new society with all of the old prejudices or whatever. And it's the issue of Moses supposedly keeping the Israelites in the desert for 40 years, so they get over their history and the feeling of being a slave. But what happens in capitalism is we have within us, as you're all aware, in our human nature, so many different aspects to it, from the very best, altruism and empathy with other people, to the very worst, which is actually murder. Obviously, people murder other people. I maintain that under capitalism, it brings out the worst in us. It brings out the individualism. It brings out greed. Greed, with the Wall Street movie, where Gordon Gekko says greed is good. He's right. Greed is good for capitalism. If you're a capitalist, it is good to be greedy. And it brings out the competitiveness in you for jobs. It brings out the competitiveness of different corporations in different countries, etc. It brings out the worst, and it represses the best, which is sympathy for our fellow human beings, cooperativeness with other people. And so what we need to do is as we are transforming ourselves, this needs to be kept in mind, that we have been brought up in a society in which certain aspects have been stressed, certain characteristics within our human nature have been rewarded, and other ones have been punished in some cases. This doesn't mean there aren't empathetic people, and there aren't people who are cooperative in a capital society, but capitalism suppresses these aspects of our human nature and brings up the worst. And how do you then have a person that's brought up in that way involved in the transformation? One needs to transform themselves as society is being transformed, and it's no simple task. You know the quote?
No. I remember the general idea that you're talking about. I agree with your interpretation, I think. In the course of your comments, one of the things you mentioned was there has been a long series of revolutionaries, radicals who were interested in the environment. And it goes back to another question that was asked earlier about why did the old left not address the environment. So I guess the answer really should be that it's a more complicated answer than to say that it either did or didn't, because there are always these contradictory strains. And R. and Gare did this interesting work, I don't know how to say his name, I'm guessing, but about what happened in Russia after the revolution. And pointed out that actually Lenin was a strong conservationist. Stalin didn't really keep with that idea, but that was another transformation that opposite that happened. But it wasn't only Lenin, but there was this whole tendency within the Bolsheviks that I'm not sure if Gare is maybe exaggerating their differences with Lenin, but like led by Bogdanov and Lunacharsky, that really wanted to make it a much deeper understanding of the environment and really change the cultural relationship of people in Russia to the environment, so to nature. I mean, it's interesting, but it goes to the point, I think, that these strains were actually always there in a certain sense. Even in the Second International, so much of which was very mechanical and uncritical of industrial development, largely. There were still people within it who, frankly, even Kautsky wrote something about it, about picking up on Marx, what I quoted from Marx about capitalism destroying the soil's fertility. But I don't think it really meant much to him, So there was, but I think it was because it was a strong enough thing in Marx, and it was in Engels too, that you could still hear echoes of it among these people who their theory really, in essence, didn't appreciate that, but they studied Marx and picked out these things that then would mean nothing to them if they had gained power in Germany or something. But so I'm just saying that it's really true, and that it's not only in the Marxist movement, but I think one of the fascinating studies of history of the environmental movement, I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Gottlieb, Forcing the Spring, the dual roots of environmentalism. I think that's important. Maybe you disagree with that, but that is, conservation is one strand, but public health is another one. It's a very different sort of character of a movement. That goes back to Jane Addams' Hull House and all that stuff. And it's still alive today because, for example, the environmental justice movement has such a completely different character from mainstream conservation environmentalism. And frankly, I come from the anti-nuke movement originally, which was not quite like that conservation stuff, because the point is these things are bad for people. The point was, to us, I think, largely, although also bad for nature, right? And environmental justice always grabbed me a lot more than this conservation stuff, because, my God, this is what's happening to people in our society. And that's one of the things that really makes it an organic unity between environmentalism and labor, because it's largely the working class that's involved in these struggles against environmental racism. So I think that those are aspects of the environmental movement is a very complicated thing. It's not like a class-based movement. It's not like an identity-based movement. It has a lot of different contradictory strands to it that we should be cognizant of.
I think we'll take one more question from the back, and then maybe the panelists can kind of wrap up any concluding remarks or reflections into that. we're a bit over 9 p.m., but we did start a little bit late. First, before the question, just thank all of our panelists for coming, and for all of you for sticking around. And you can pick up copies of the Platypus Review and everything back at the table if you're interested. And yeah, so I think we'll take your question.
Well, the question really is, we have the Philippines, and that's sort of the most immediate thing. And I wanted to hear how people on the panel relate what they've been saying to this concrete tragedy that's happened. I wanted to that's my question, but I really wanted to also say something about this booty lift because it was making me so mad. Because no little girl wakes up and, when she's 10 or something and looks at her body and says, oh, I need a booty lift. So what you're really talking about is that you want some kind of revolution that changes the objectification of women along with everything else you're talking about. So I liked what Franklin said about how expansive we have to think about revolution and how deep and total it has to be. And when you're fighting for that kind of revolution, I think it impacts this question of, that we've been talking about what people can have. Because if you really have a sort of total kind of change, people are not going to need all the things that they think they need. Because if you have a child today who is a shunt baby, or you adopt one, which a friend of mine did, you cannot get her dental work. It's not covered under anything. So yeah, you want money. You have to have it. There's a lot of fear in our society about not having enough because there's consequences about not having enough. You can't take care of your parents. Nobody else is going to take care of them. So that's the kind of revolution we need. And that changes the whole discussion about what it is we need.
Okay. And I neglected to mention earlier, we also have newsletters, copies there.
Just briefly, maybe I'll do it without the microphone. I mean, so much of what we think we need has been, we have become convinced that we need it because of this massive advertising and sales effort of corporations. And this has to do with the. I mean, I have now a granddaughter who's 4 years old in a couple of weeks, and I'm very concerned about the whole issue of how young girls view their image, etc. I think this is stuff that is learned, though. It is learned in a particular type of society that is doing this not because they're evil people. They're doing this to try to make money. That's all there is to it. Same reason why Monsanto is creating all these GMOs. They think they're trying to save the world. They're trying to make a buck. That's the way they make a buck. Somebody else makes it somewhere else. That's all. And if they can convince a girl to buy something or whatever, then that's fine.
I'm going away from the booty lifts. I was going to put in a word for McDonald's.
A good word?
Yeah. I mean, it's I know plenty of people who really like those sandwiches, and I have to admit to having enjoyed a Big Mac once or twice in my life too. And I don't think it was because the McDonald's advertising people caused me to do that. I think people are. I think it's more complicated than that. There are these big forces out there that are fooling people into wanting things that they really don't want. It's a much longer conversation. That's all I'd say.
The junk food industry scientifically discovers what it can make you addicted to Okay?
And it tastes good.
Salt plus
It tastes
fat.
good.
They devised formulas for this,
Yeah,
okay?
right.
So this is not something that just happened. It's not something that just happened. They've designed stuff that is not good for you to taste good, and you're going to want it more. So it's not just something that happened. It happened because of a corporation that wants to sell stuff. So happens their stuff is a hamburger or whatever.
Yeah. Food expert.
Oh, no,
I shouldn't.
maybe just to, I think those are, thank you very much for the comment, and maybe just very generally, I think that the question of sort of immediate industrial market profit and the role of homophobia, sexism, racism in society, I don't think are actually easily correlatable. And I think that maybe begs the larger question of how does our economy as such and our systems of production and consumption, how are they tied to relations of power? And I think that is a bigger question, but I think actually at the same time that I completely agree that profit is the kind of conceptual constant driving force for capitalism. I think that there's more going on in terms of human relations, that are not easily reducible to those numbers. So, and I think that it is not right to say that profit is the reason that sexism exists. It's simply not true. And so I think that although they interact. So, I don't have an answer, but I want to thank you for bringing that up, certainly.
On the first part of your question about what?
Yeah, you need to.
The first part of your question on the Philippines, you're talking about the typhoon, I'm sure. I think that is an example of the kinds of things that probably motivate all of us to want to do something about the state of, whether we call it the Anthropocene or not, but the state of the world today as determined by human activity. And of course, most of the scientists are going to say we can't connect one particular storm with causation by global warming. But then in the same sentence, they'll probably add, but you can expect more of these as the climate continues to warm. And I don't know. I don't want to go on too long about it but I think it illuminates a lot about how we deal with climate change. Not just that human activity is causing climate change, but how human society is adapting to it. That one of the very symbolic things was in a lot of these places in the Philippines, the first relief that was coming on U.S. Navy helicopters. And of course the U.S. military loves that because it's good PR. But we should all turn around and think, well, wait a minute. Why is it that the resources that exist, that are available to help out people who are suffering from these disasters, are in the hands of the military? And if they were busy in some war somewhere, they would not be available. But the truth is that a lot of the emergency resources are in the hands of the military, and the priority is, of course, to whatever military conflict they could be devoted to. And you cannot separate the fact of the tremendous resources that the U.S. military has to deploy anywhere in the world. You can't separate that from the dearth of resources in many countries that many national governments, state and local governments have to deal with the problems that are caused by climate change. And even I think the Philippine delegate to the climate change negotiations that are going on now in Poland, I believe it was him who I read made some point about the contrast between the millions of dollars that the U.S. will spend on one particular thing going on. I can't remember the specifics, but some kind of profit-making thing, right? Versus the smaller amount that it will devote to pledges for this world fund to help poor countries adapt to climate change. And I'm not talking about private expenditures. I'm talking about U.S. government expenditures. That, and I'm sure that Professor Weinreb could tell us hair-raising tales about what the money that goes for U.S. food aid really does or doesn't do. But I think that it does connect, because whether we like it or not, increasing resources are going to be devoted to adapting to climate change. And as long as we're under the regime of capitalism, they will be devoted in a way that's militaristic and in a way that preserves the class structure, that is going to help the 1% more than 99%. I look at Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath of that as sort of the model for what we can expect in the future, where poor people were herded into a stadium and black people were shot on the bridges and in the streets.
Thank you all for sticking around, and let's thank our panelists. This is the first material, so if you found the conversation here interesting, be sure to go to the website and look for future panels that we're putting on a similar theme. So thank you, and good night.
Okay. Not so bad, huh? Not so bad. Some interesting stuff.
I thought you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I could have said a lot. You were setting me up for an hour-long diatribe. It's after hours.
Yeah, I understand.
So you're heading back tonight? Sorry. You're heading back tonight? No, just one for you.